For the privacy of the individuals involved, some names and details have been changed. Any resemblance to people, companies, or events mentioned is purely coincidental. This narrative is intended for illustrative and entertainment purposes, not as an exact representation of all events and circumstances. It was a hot November afternoon in the small town of Monte, Azul, deep in Brazil's interior. Marissa, a young woman of 24, was finishing her shift at the clothing store where she worked. Modestly beautiful, her eyes reflected a mix of shyness and sweetness, traits that stem from her strict upbringing in a traditional evangelical family. From a young age, Marissa had adhered to the church's principles, always staying committed to moral and religious values. Her world was small, and her life expectations revolved around continuing to work to support her family, and maybe someday marrying a good man from the church. Her future seemed simple and mapped out until Antonio, a charming and successful local merchant, entered her life. Antonio owned a furniture store and enjoyed a solid reputation among the townspeople. Married for over 10 years, he seemed to be a man of principles, but privately, he was consumed by a desire to control and acquire anything he wanted. When he met Marissa, a dangerous spark was ignited within him. He saw something different in her from other girls he had known. The purity and respect she was known for became the center of his obsession. They began talking during Antonio's visits to the store where Marissa worked. The merchant always seemed to know just what to say to melt her heart. He praised her demeanor, showed genuine interest in her stories, and gradually created a connection that Marissa couldn't ignore. At first, she resisted. The church had taught her to stay firm, away from any temptation. But as the months passed, she found herself increasingly drawn to this man who gave her the attention and affection she had never experienced before. Guilt grew within her, but the desire to live this forbidden passion consumed her. Thus, one night in December, they met outside the usual setting. Antonio convinced Marissa to sneak away from her family and the church to go on a private date. That moment changed their relationship completely, and Marissa gave herself to the merchant, breaking all the principles she had fought for throughout her life. Months later, the unexpected happened. Now pregnant with Antonio's child, Marissa felt the weight of what it meant. The shame before the church, her family, and the scandal this situation could generate was too much to bear. Desperate, she told Antonio about the pregnancy, hoping he would take responsibility and protect her from the consequences. But Antonio's reaction was entirely different from what Marissa expected. Overwhelmed by fear that his wife would find out and by the social pressure of a small town, he urged her to have an abortion. He saw the baby as a risk to his reputation and a threat to his marriage. Marissa, however, flatly refused. Raised to value life above all, she couldn't take the life of this baby, even if it meant losing everything she had. Furious at her decision and fearing the secret would come out, Antonio began hatching a dark plan. Deep down, he knew he had to rid himself of this problem, but lacked the courage to face public scandal. One night, Antonio suggested a covert trip as a way to resolve the situation. He showed up at Marissa's house in his truck, promising to take her somewhere quiet where they could talk and find a solution. Despite her mistrust, she accepted, believing that perhaps Antonio had changed his mind and wanted to take responsibility for his part in the story. As they drove along a deserted road lined with dense vegetation and hills, Marissa, sitting in the passenger seat, felt a growing unease. The night was dark, and Antonio remained silent, with a cold expression on his face. At a certain point, he looked at her and, in a chillingly dry voice, said, "I'm going to end this. There's no other way." Fear overtook Marissa. She knew his words were not empty threats. Her survival instinct kicked in, and in a moment of desperation, without thinking of the consequences, She opened the moving truck's door and jumped out. She tumbled down a ravine, landing among the thick vegetation. She felt her bones hitting rocks and dirt, but adrenaline kept her from feeling the pain. Disoriented and unable to locate her in the dark of the night, Antonio was consumed by a mixture of rage and fear. Unable to find her, he returned home, concocting a story of an accident, in case anyone asked about her disappearance. A few hours later, as dawn broke, some local farmers tending to their cattle near a corral heard faint cries coming from nearby. Following the sound, they found Marissa, bloodied and unconscious amidst the vegetation. They immediately took her to the nearest hospital, but without identification, she could not be identified right away. Marissa remained in critical condition for a week until her family, already frantically searching for her, found her. When questioned, Antonio claimed he had had a car accident and couldn't he remember anything about that night. In the hospital, Marissa lay on her bed, still under the effects of the medication that kept her sedated. The fall had left her with broken arms and ribs, along with numerous cuts and bruises across her body. However, it was the psychological trauma that tormented her most. The delicate face that once radiated the dreams of a young woman full of hope now reflected pain and fear. Her family, especially her mother, Dona Olinda, a woman of unbreakable faith and a devout member of the church, was devastated by her daughter's state and the mystery surrounding the events of that night. Marissa was slowly recovering, but the emotional pain felt even more shattering than her broken bones. Dona Olinda visited her daily in the hospital, holding her daughter's hands, whispering words of comfort and praying. Yet deep down, she sensed that Marissa was hiding something terrible. Marissa would look away whenever her mother tried to ask what had really happened that night. And Dona Olinda knew that behind her daughter's silence, there was a pain that no prayer could seem to heal. As Marissa struggled with the memories of that night, Antonio went on acting as if nothing had happened. He continued attending church with his wife, Sandra, keeping up his image of a righteous man. Respected by the community, he was present at every social event and generous in his donations to the church. Sandra seemed to suspect nothing, and Antonio carefully kept up appearances. However, alone at night, the weight of guilt gnawed at him, haunted by the thought that Marissa might reveal the truth at any moment. One afternoon, Marissa was finally discharged from the hospital. She returned home to a town full of suspicious glances and whispered comments. Some townsfolk speculated about what could have brought her to such a state. Some believed it was an accident, while others thought she had tried to take her own life. Yet no one dared mention Antonio in their suspicions. To everyone else, he was still the ideal merchant, a family man, and a pillar of the town. Amid this turmoil, Marissa realized that she needed to gather strength to face the judgment of the community and protect the child she was carrying. Each passing day, the baby grew within her, reminding her of the choices she had made and the consequences she would face. She knew her family and the church would never forgive her if they learned the truth. At the same time, the thought of remaining silent tormented her, like carrying an invisible weight that threatened to crush her at any moment. Dona Olinda, sensing her daughter's growing anguish, decided to confront her once again. "Daughter, I need you to tell me what really happened. You know I'm here to help you, but I need the truth." Marissa, her eyes filling with tears, struggled to speak, feeling a knot in her throat that held her secret captive. Yet under her mother's persistent gaze, she finally murmured, "Mom, there are things it's better if you don't know." Meanwhile, Antonio faced his own private hell. The fear that Marissa would decide to tell the truth kept him on edge. He spent sleepless nights plotting ways to protect his reputation. In the silence of one of those sleepless nights, He had a sinister idea. What if he could silence Marissa for good? The thought haunted him, but the urge to protect everything he had built seemed to justify any action. Dona Olinda, in her unease, began to discreetly observe Antonio's behavior, and small suspicions began to form in her mind. His unexpected appearances at the hospital, the veiled questions about Marissa's emotional state, and the cold glances he shot at her daughter when he thought no one was watching. Gradually, this devout woman began to question whether this man was as honorable as everyone believed. Meanwhile, Marissa's younger brother, Carlos, a young, hot-headed man fiercely loyal to his family, couldn't accept his sister's story about the accident. He pressured her, convinced that she was hiding something. "Marissa, you need to trust me. I can protect you, but only if you tell me what's really going on," he urged. Marissa, however, just cried and begged him to drop the subject, fearing the danger Antonio posed. As time passed, Dona Olinda and Carlos's suspicions grew. Finally, after a restless night haunted by nightmares, Marissa broke down and revealed to her brother what really happened the night she was found in the ravine. Carlos listened in silence, his face hardening as the horror of the story sank in. He promised his sister he would seek justice, but Marissa, terrified, begged him not to tell anyone. "I don't want you to get hurt, Carlos," she whispered, clutching her brother's hand. Unbeknownst to Marissa, Carlos had no intention of standing by idly. Secretly, he began following Antonio's every move, his routines, his contacts, the people he met. Carlos knew that facing a man as influential as Antonio could come at a high price, but he was determined not to let his sister's suffering go unpunished. Antonio, for his part, noticed Carlos's constant presence and grew increasingly worried about the threat he posed. The tension between Antonio and Marissa's family was becoming unbearable. One day, Carlos confronted Antonio in the center of town, in front of other merchants and townsfolk. With a look of pure anger, he threw out a threat. "You can fool the others, but not me, Antonio. I know what you did to my sister, and I'll make sure you pay for it." Antonio, trying to stay calm, forced a cold smile and walked away, but Carlos's threat stayed with him. The fear of retaliation led Antonio to make a drastic decision. He decided to sell his store and leave town. He claimed to have received a new business opportunity in another city, but everyone in the town sensed there was something unusual about his sudden departure. The days following Antonio's departure were filled with deep reflection for Marissa. He had finally left Monte Azul, and the town gradually returned to its quiet rhythm. Yet, although he was gone, the scars he left in her life ran deep and were difficult to heal. Every time she heard a whisper or felt judging eyes on her at church, Marissa would shrink inwardly, feeling the weight of shame that still lingered. Carlos, however, was not satisfied. To him, Antonio's departure without real punishment felt like an open wound. He didn't see the merchant's exit as justice, but as an escape. Dona Olinda tried to calm her son, urging him to believe that peace would come with time and with Marissa's emotional recovery. But Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. Weeks passed, and Marissa focused her energy on accepting the child that was soon to arrive. While she felt fear and uncertainty, a maternal bond was growing inside her, bringing a new sense of hope, something she hadn't felt since the day Antonio had crossed her path. With every movement of the baby in her womb, she saw a chance to build a new life and to give her child a future free from the shadows of the past. Then, on a sunny morning, an unexpected piece of news spread through the village. Antonio had been found dead on a dirt road in the neighboring state. The The circumstances of his death were hazy, and for many, mysterious. Some rumors said it was an accident, but others whispered of a possible revenge. When Carlos heard the news, he merely raised an eyebrow and returned to his work, showing no emotion. Marissa, upon hearing about Antonio's death, felt a mix of difficult-to-decipher emotions. A part of her felt relieved, as if an invisible weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders. But another part felt an odd emptiness, as if the dark cycle of her life had closed suddenly and tragically. She knew that regardless of how his story had ended, the inner scar she carried would still take time to heal. The town, as small towns often do, quickly divided in its opinions about Antonio's death. To some, he had received what he deserved, a sort of divine justice. Others mourned the loss of a seemingly respectable businessman, without ever knowing the truth that lay beneath his public image. A few days later, Marissa walked through the town with her noticeably advanced belly, and she noticed that people looked at her differently. It was no longer a gaze of judgment, but something closer to curiosity, even respect. The strength she showed by moving forward, despite everything, was beginning to change the way people viewed her. For the first time, she felt she might actually be able to rebuild her life in Monte Azul, without having to flee from whispers and accusing glances. As time passed, Marissa gave birth to a healthy boy, whom she named Gabriel, a name symbolizing strength and protection. Gabriel's birth brought a light to her life that she thought she would never see again. The baby became her reason for living, and in him, she found a way to redeem herself and move forward. Gradually, the town began to forget what had happened. Monte Azul, always eager for gossip, turned its attention to new events, allowing old stories to fade from the town's collective memory. Marissa, in turn, became a reserved and resilient woman, finding comfort in the small moments of happiness with her son that she so deeply desired. Years later, when Gabriel was grown, Marissa finally shared parts of her story with him, without delving into the most painful details. She wanted him to know where they had come from, but she always reminded her son that the past would not define what he could become. And together, mother and son moved forward, building a life full of hope and free from the shadows of Monte Azul. The end.